You're taught from birth that an Omega's scent is their identity. It's supposed to be honey or lavender or rain on hot asphalt, something that draws people in. Mine was just dead. A blank space where a soul should be. I spent 26 years convinced I was fundamentally broken, invisible, until the day my body was screaming in an agony I couldn't hide anymore, and the coldest man in the city shattered a boardroom table just to reach me. The alarm buzzed at 5 a.m. I didn't hit snooze. I just lay there staring at the water stain on the ceiling, listening to the radiator clank. My name is Leo. I'm a data analyst for Ryan Omnimedia, and I am a defective Omega. I dragged myself out of bed. The bathroom mirror was still cracked from when my roommate moved out and slammed the door too hard. I reached for the scent blockers in the medicine cabinet out of pure conditioned habit. They were expensive. They were also entirely useless. Blockers are designed to mute the sweet, cloying pheromones that Omegas produce under stress during heat, or when they experience strong emotions. You take a pill, and it acts like an acoustic foam for your biology. But my biology didn't make any noise. I had no scent, no honey, no vanilla, not even the faint sour tang of anxiety. Doctors called it idiopathic olfactory suppression. I called it being a ghost. I swallowed the pill anyway. Dry. It scratched going down. If corporate found out I was a blank, they'd look at me sideways. In the modern corporate world, biology is a background hum. Alphas are usually executives. They smell like cedar or ozone or black coffee authority. Betas are the glue smelling like clean linen or nothing at all. Omegas are the creatives, the diplomats. We're supposed to smell approachable. I smelled like the fluorescent lights hanging over my cubicle. The subway was packed. A tall alpha in a tailored suit bumped into my shoulder. His scent flaring briefly in irritation crushed mint and exhaust fumes. He didn't even look down. If I had smelled like a proper Omega, his biology would have forced a polite nod, a murmured apology. Instead, I was just an obstacle. I preferred it that way. Invisibility is safe. I arrived at the Ryan building 20 minutes early. Floor 42. Glass walls. Polished concrete. The air here was hyper-filtered, designed to neutralize the chaotic mix of 300 employees' pheromones. But today, the filtration system was working overtime. Matthew Ryan was in the building. You didn't need to smell him to know he was there. The temperature on the floor seemed to drop 5 degrees. Beta assistants were power walking instead of strolling. Alpha middle managers stood a little straighter, suppressing their own sense out of primal deference. Matthew was the CEO. He took over the company 3 years ago and gutted it, turning a failing media conglomerate into a ruthless, precision-engineered machine. I had seen him exactly twice in 3 years. He was tall, built like a heavyweight fighter forced into an expensive Italian suit with eyes the color of old ice. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His scent alone, which was rumored to be the sharp, suffocating cold of a winter storm before the snow falls, was enough to make board members agree to terms they hated. Leo. Hey, Earth to Leo. I blinked. Greg, the senior project manager, was snapping his fingers in front of my face. He was an alpha who smelled faintly of cheap cologne and stale beer. The Q3 projection decks. Greg said, his voice tight with panic. Do you have them? On the server. Folder labeled final_Ryan_review. I said, my voice flat. Print them. 3 copies. Color. Ryan just moved the executive review up by 2 hours. We're on in 20 minutes. My stomach performed a slow, sickening roll. I'm just the data compiler, Greg. I don't need to be in the review. Ryan wants the raw data guy in the room in case he has questions about the algorithms. You're coming. Don't look like that. Just sit in the corner, don't speak unless spoken to, and whatever you do, don't drop anything. I turned back to my monitor. My chest felt tight. Not just with the standard low-level dread of existing in corporate America, but with a sharp physical hitch. I had slipped on the icy concrete steps of my apartment building the night before. I had landed hard on the edge of a metal railing. I hadn't gone to the hospital. Rent was due in a week. I had taped my ribs with athletic tape and swallowed 4 ibuprofen. As I reached for the mouse to hit print, a profound, agonizing spike of pain shot up my left side. It stole my breath. I gripped the edge of the desk, waiting for the edges of my vision to stop going black. 20 minutes, just sit in the corner. I could do that. I was a ghost. Ghosts don't feel pain. The boardroom was a sterile expanse of glass and chrome, suspended over the city like a fishbowl for predators. The long table was made of black marble. At the head of it sat Matthew Ryan. Up close, the rumors about him felt inadequate. He wasn't just intimidating. He was an event horizon. He sat perfectly still, listening as Greg sweated through his presentation. Matthew's hands rested on the table, a heavy gold pen held loosely between his long fingers. He wore a dark slate suit. He smelled like nothing I had ever encountered. It wasn't the aggressive, choking scent most powerful alphas weaponized. It was cold. Absolute zero. It smelled like the silence in the woods just before a tree snaps under the weight of ice. I sat in the chair, pushed against the far wall furthest from the door. My laptop was open on my knees. I was supposed to be cross-referencing the metrics as Greg spoke. I wasn't doing that. I was trying to breathe without screaming. The ibuprofen had worn off entirely. The athletic tape around my chest felt like it was made of barbed wire. Every time my heart beat, the fractured bone in my ribcage ground against tissue. A cold sweat had broken out on the back of my neck. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing Apple logo of the laptop in front of me, forcing my breaths into shallow, rapid sips. In. 2-3. Out. 2-3. These projections are optimistic. Gregory? Matthew's voice cut through the room. It was a baritone smooth, but devoid of warmth. Greg faltered, wiping his brow. The scent of sour, terrified alpha began to pollute the room. Sir, the algorithm accounts for the market dip in... The algorithm is a tool, Matthew interrupted gently. It was the gentleness of a scalpel. It relies on the parameters set by the operator. If you feed it garbage, it gives me a very nicely formatted pie chart of garbage. Greg swallowed audibly. The parameters were set by... He looked directly at me. Coward. Matthew's gaze shifted. It was the first time he had looked at me since I entered the room. His eyes were a pale, striking gray. They locked onto mine, and I felt the physical weight of his attention. "You're the analyst," Matthew asked. I needed to speak. I needed to say, "Yes, Mr. Ryan." The parameters were based on a conservative 5-year historical average. I opened my mouth. I took a breath to speak. My rib shifted. The pain wasn't a spike this time. It was an explosion. It felt like someone had driven a white-hot railroad spike through my lungs. My vision inverted. The room tilted violently. I couldn't breathe out. My vocal cords paralyzed. I slumped forward, catching myself on my knees, my laptop sliding dangerously close to the edge of my lap. Hide it. Hide it. You're invisible. But the body has limits. The human nervous system wasn't designed to endure agony without a distress signal. My brain panicked, dying for oxygen, slammed the emergency button. It bypassed the expensive scent blockers. It bypassed my 26 years of being a defective blank. My biology broke open. I didn't smell like honey. I didn't smell like flowers. The scent that violently ripped through the sterile air of the boardroom was the smell of raw metallic blood. It was the scent of ozone, right where lightning strikes. It was the bitter, agonizing smell of an animal caught in a steel trap, chewing its own leg off to survive. It wasn't a scent meant to attract a mate. It was an emergency flare fired into the dark. Pure, concentrated omega distress. It hit the room like a physical shock wave. Greg gagged, stumbling back against the whiteboard. Two other executives at the table clamped hands over their mouths, their eyes wide with sudden, unexplainable nausea. My pain was so intense, it was weaponized. It was flooding their systems, triggering their deep-seated biological aversion to catastrophic injury. I squeezed my eyes shut, my forehead resting on the cool aluminum of my laptop. I was shaking violently. I had ruined everything. I was going to be fired. I was going to be thrown out into the street. The pain in my side was a roaring fire, but the shame was worse. I was finally making a sound, and it was hideous. Then the sound of a heavy snap echoed through the room. I forced my eyes open, peering through the blur of my own tears. At the head of the table, Matthew Ryan was standing. The gold pen he had been holding was broken cleanly in two. Ink was bleeding into the pores of the black marble. He wasn't looking at Greg. He wasn't looking at the projection. He was staring at me. His face, previously a mask of aristocratic boredom, was gone. His eyes were completely dilated, the pupils swallowing the gray. The temperature in the room plummeted, the air pressure dropping so fast my ears popped. The smell of winter storm and cold iron surged, completely drowning out Greg's terror and the other executives' nausea. It didn't drown out my scent. It wrapped around it. Matthew's chest heaved once. The alpha inside him, the primal architecture buried under billions of dollars in bespoke suits, had heard the emergency flare. "Mr. Ryan," Greg stammered, completely bewildered, rubbing his own throat. What is that smell? Did something short-circuit? Matthew didn't look at him. His voice, when it came, wasn't human. It was a guttural, terrifying vibration that rattled the glass walls of the room. "Get out!" Nobody moved. The sheer dissonance between the Matthew Ryan, who discussed profit margins, and the creature currently vibrating with barely suppressed violence paralyzed them. "Sir," the VP of Marketing whispered, her hand hovering over her tablet. Matthew finally tore his gaze away from me. He looked at the VP. The terrifying blankness in his eyes made her flinch violently. I said, Matthew growled every syllable coated in frost and absolute authority. "Get out, every single one of you. Leave the room." "But the presentation..." Greg started, his corporate brain failing to compute the biological reality of the room. Matthew moved. He didn't run. He just crossed the distance from the head of the table to Greg in two massive strides. He grabbed Greg by the lapels of his suit and hauled him off his feet. Greg let out a choked squeak. "If you are not out of this room in 3 seconds..." Matthew whispered, his voice dangerously quiet now. "I will throw you through that window." Greg scrambled. The moment Matthew released him, he bolted for the heavy oak doors. The rest of the executives didn't need to be told twice. Chairs scraped violently against the floor. Binders were left open. Coffee spilled across the marble, dripping onto the carpet. They flooded out the door like rats fleeing a sinking ship, stumbling over each other to escape the crushing, suffocating weight of Matthew's alpha pheromones. I tried to stand up. I needed to leave with them. I was the problem. I was the source of the infection. I pushed off the chair, but my right leg wouldn't take the weight. The fractured rib shifted again, a sickening pop echoing in my own ears. A choked, pathetic sob tore out of my throat, and I collapsed sideways, missing the chair entirely and hitting the carpeted floor. The heavy oak doors slammed shut. The click of the electronic lock engaging sounded like a gunshot. We were alone. I lay on my side on the floor, curled tightly around my chest. My breathing was jagged loud in the sudden silence of the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the yelling, waiting for the disgust, waiting for the alpha to realize that the source of the hideous broken scent was just a defective data analyst who couldn't even stand up. Footsteps, slow, heavy. They stopped right in front of me. I saw the tips of his polished leather Oxfords. "Don't," I gasped out, my voice sounding like crushed glass. "Don't look. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'll go." I tried to drag myself backward. A massive, warm hand clamped down on my shoulder. I flinched violently, expecting a strike, expecting to be hauled up like Greg. Instead, the grip was incredibly gentle. It was anchoring. "Stop moving," Matthew commanded. His voice was no longer the terrifying growl from moments ago. It was low, rough, and vibrating, with an intense, focused urgency. "You are injuring yourself further. Stop." I couldn't stop shaking. The pain was blinding, but the overwhelming presence of him was short-circuiting my brain. The smell of cold iron and snow was everywhere. It was sinking into my skin, forcing my heart rate to slow down. It was an alpha command woven directly into his scent. "Calm down. You are safe. Stand down." "Look at me," he said. I shook my head, keeping my chin tucked to my chest. "I can't. My scent. It's broken. It's defective. It's making you sick. I'm sorry. Your scent," Matthew said, his voice dropping another octave, "is telling me that you are bleeding internally, that you are in a state of severe shock, and that you have been hiding an acute injury for at least 12 hours. My breath hitched. I finally opened my eyes and looked up. Matthew Ryan, the billionaire CEO. The man who made board members cry was kneeling on the floor in his $3,000 suit. He didn't look disgusted. He looked devastated. His coal gray eyes were scanning my face, cataloging the sweat, the pallor, the trembling. He reached out his hand, hovering over my side, where my arm was clamped against my ribs. He didn't touch me without permission. "What did you do?" he asked softly. "I fell," I whispered. "Stairs, ice. Did you go to a hospital?" "No." "Why?" I let out a breathless, painful laugh. "Rent." Something dark and terrible flashed in Matthew's eyes. The scent in the room spiked the winter storm, turning into a blizzard. But it wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the world that had forced me to tape my ribs and sit in a boardroom. "May I touch you?" he asked. I hesitated. I was a ghost. People didn't touch ghosts. But the pain was unendurable, and the warmth radiating from his hand was a lifeline in the dark. I gave a tiny, jerky nod. Matthew's hand bypassed my arm entirely. He gently unbuttoned the bottom 3 buttons of my dress shirt. He pulled the fabric aside, exposing the cheap frayed athletic tape wound tightly around my torso. The skin at the edges of the tape was bruised and ugly, mottled black and purple. He didn't pull away. He didn't cover his nose. He traced the edge of the bruising with a feather-light touch. A jolt of electricity shot through my skin, completely bypassing the pain in my ribs. "This is wrapped too tight," Matthew murmured, his jaw clenched. "It's restricting your lung capacity. You're suffocating yourself." "It hurts less when it doesn't move," I reasoned weakly. "You're a fool," he said. But there was no heat in it. It sounded like a prayer. He shifted his weight, pulling a phone out of his pocket with his free hand. He hit a single button. "Helipad," Matthew said into the phone. "Have the medical team waiting. Severe trauma, potential rib fractures, possible internal bleeding. Clear the airspace." He hung up before whoever was on the other end could answer. He put the phone away and looked back down at me. "We are going to the roof," Matthew said. "I can't walk." I admitted, the shame burning hot in my cheeks. "I know." Before I could protest, Matthew slid one arm under my shoulders and the other under my knees. He lifted me. I gasped as my ribs shifted, but he pulled me tight against his chest, locking my body in place against his solid warmth. The movement of the broken bones stopped. I was pressed against the source of the winter storm. His heart was beating against my ear, a heavy, steady, furious rhythm. "Close your eyes, Leo," Matthew ordered softly as he turned toward the locked oak doors. "Let me do the work." I closed my eyes. For the first time in 26 years, I wasn't invisible. My scent wasn't broken. It had just been waiting for someone who knew how to listen to the dark. The boardroom doors did not open. They were kicked open. Matthew's polished leather shoe hit the heavy oak with a force that splintered the frame. The lock shattered raining brass and wood shards onto the hallway carpet. I buried my face into the lapel of his suit, squeezing my eyes shut against the jarring impact, though Matthew's grip on me absorbed almost all of the shock. The executive floor was a ghost town. The people who ran a multi-billion-dollar empire had scattered like roaches when the lights turned on. I could hear a few hushed, terrified whispers from behind closed office doors. The air out here was still thick with the residual terror of the alphas who had fled. Matthew walked right through it. His chest rose and fell in a steady, powerful rhythm beneath my cheek. I was 26 years old. I paid my own taxes. I bought my own groceries. Being carried like a child should have been the most humiliating experience of my life. Instead, a treacherous, deeply buried part of my biology was humming with a sick, desperate relief. "Safe," my hindbrain whispered. "The big alpha has us. Safe." I hated it. I gritted my teeth, trying to pull back, trying to assert some semblance of autonomy. "I can walk," I rasped. Mr. Ryan put me down. "People are going to see." "Let them," Matthew said. He didn't even look down. His jaw was set in a hard, unforgiving line. We reached the end of the corridor. The private executive elevator, a sleek glass tube that ran up the exterior of the building, stood open. A young beta woman wearing a tailored pencil skirt and holding an iPad like a shield was standing rigid beside the console. Her name was Claire. She was Matthew's chief of staff. Claire took one look at Matthew, then at the bloodless, shivering mess in his arms, and her eyes widened. "Roof," Matthew barked. It wasn't a request. Claire slammed her hand onto the biometric scanner. "Helicopter is 2 minutes out, sir. Trauma team at St. Jude's is on standby." Dr. Miller is clearing the ER. Tell Miller if he brings any unbonded alphas into that room, I will buy the hospital and fire him, Matthew said evenly as he stepped into the glass cab. Understood, Claire said, her voice shaking, only slightly. The doors slid shut, sealing us in. The elevator shot upward. The sudden acceleration pressed my internal organs downward, and the fractured rib ground viciously against my lung. I couldn't stop the sharp, pathetic whine that tore out of my throat. My fingers dug convulsively into the expensive wool of Matthew's suit jacket. Instantly, the scent of the winter storm in the enclosed space intensified. It wasn't oppressive. It was a localized anesthetic. Alpha pheromones, when utilized for protection rather than dominance, trigger a massive endorphin release in a distressed omega. My vision, which had been going gray at the edges, slowly cleared. The sharp edges of the pain began to blur, muffled by the heavy, freezing scent of him. "Breathe, Leo," Matthew commanded softly. He shifted his grip, sliding his arm slightly higher up my back to take all the pressure off my rib cage. "Shallow breaths. We are almost there." I looked out the glass wall of the elevator. The city of Seattle sprawled out beneath us, a grid of concrete glass and crawling traffic under a heavy gray sky. I felt entirely detached from it. I was a data analyst in a wrinkled Uniqlo shirt, bleeding internally, being held by a man whose net worth was higher than the GDP of a small island nation. It was absurd. It was a statistical anomaly. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the elevator cables. Matthew looked down at me. The absolute feral intensity in his gray eyes hadn't faded. If anything, it had focused entirely on my face. He looked at my mouth, the bruise forming on my jaw, from where I had hit the floor and the sweat dampening my hair. "You are dying in my boardroom," Matthew stated, as if it were a simple matter of logistics. "You expect me to step over you and continue a quarterly review." Greg would have. Greg Matthew said, the name dripping with absolute disgust, "will be clearing out his desk before the sun sets." He didn't know. I closed my eyes, the exhaustion pulling at my bones like gravity. Nobody knew. I take blockers. I don't smell like anything. I'm broken. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open to the rooftop helipad. The wind immediately howled into the cab, bringing the smell of impending rain and aviation fuel. Matthew didn't step out immediately. He tightened his hold on me, sheltering my body from the biting wind with his own bulk. "You are not broken," Matthew said. The vibration of his voice rumbled deep in his chest, traveling directly into my skin. "Your scent is the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Now close your eyes. The rotors are loud." He stepped out into the gale. The deafening thwack, thwack, thwack of the helicopter blades drowned out everything else. I buried my face in his neck, breathing in the cold iron and snow, and let the darkness take me. Consciousness returned in jagged, confusing fragments. First the blinding glare of fluorescent lights cutting through my eyelids. Then the smell of rubbing alcohol, iodine, and clean linen. It was a sterile, sharp smell. But beneath it, heavy and suffocating, was the scent of the winter storm. I opened my eyes. I was lying on a crisp hospital bed. The ceiling tiles were pristine white. My shirt was gone. "He needs an MRI, Mr. Ryan. We cannot fully assess the internal bleeding until we get him into the machine." The voice belonged to a man. Calm, clinical beta. "Then bring the machine here," Matthew's voice replied. It didn't sound like the CEO. It sounded like a low-frequency rumble. Warning of an earthquake. Sir, it's a 3-ton magnetic tube. It doesn't move. We have to move the patient to the imaging wing. No. I turned my head slowly. The room spun nausea rolling through my gut. Matthew was standing at the foot of my bed. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a violent break. His suit jacket was gone. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with tension. His tie was loosened. But it was his posture that was terrifying. He was planted between the bed and the door, completely blocking the path of 2 doctors and a nurse. Mr. Ryan, the lead doctor, a weary-looking beta in his 50s, tried again. I understand your instincts are running high. The patient produced a severe distress scent. As an alpha, your biology is telling you to guard him, but you are currently preventing us from saving his life. You are not taking him out of my sight, Matthew snarled. The air in the room was so thick with his pheromones that the nurse was visibly trembling, clutching a clipboard to her chest. Matthew was spiraling. The biology of the Omegaverse is cruel. An alpha who claims an injured omega even unintentionally enters a protective frenzy. To his primitive hindbrain, moving me meant taking me into unknown dangerous territory. His logic was gone, replaced entirely by a predatory need to defend the perimeter. I watched the doctor reach for a syringe on a metal tray, a sedative for Matthew. If they tried to stick Matthew Ryan with a needle right now, he was going to break the doctor's arm in 3 places. Matthew. My voice was a pathetic, scratchy whisper. It shouldn't have been audible over the hum of the medical machinery. But Matthew's head snapped toward me so fast his neck cracked. The feral emptiness in his eyes fractured the second he saw I was awake. He closed the distance between the door and my bed in a single stride, dropping heavily into the plastic chair beside me. Leo. He leaned in, his large hands hovering over my chest, desperate to touch, but terrified of causing more pain. Don't move. You have 2 fractured ribs, the 4th and 5th. The tape you used caused a severe pulmonary contusion. I know, I breathed out. I can feel it. I lifted my hand. It felt like lifting a cinder block. The IV line pulling at the back of my hand stung. I reached out and grabbed Matthew's wrist. His skin was burning hot. The second my fingers wrapped around his pulse point, a violently visible shudder tore through his massive frame. He dropped his forehead against the edge of the mattress right beside my hip, his breathing ragged. You're scaring the doctors. I whispered, my thumb weakly stroking the tendon in his wrist. It was a deeply intimate gesture, something mates did to soothe each other. I didn't care. I needed him to calm down before he caught an assault charge. They wanted to take you away, Matthew muttered, his voice muffled by the blanket. I have to go to the machine, I reasoned, trying to keep my voice steady. They need to see inside. You can come. Right, doctor? I looked over Matthew's head at the physician. The doctor let out a long exhale quietly, putting the sedative syringe back on the tray. Mr. Ryan is welcome to accompany us to the imaging wing, the doctor said smoothly, catching on immediately. He can stand in the observation booth. We won't close the blinds. He'll have a direct line of sight the entire time. Matthew slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the gray darkened to charcoal. He looked at the doctor, then back to my hand on his wrist. Observation booth, Matthew repeated. If the door locks, I'll break the glass. Understood. The doctor agreed without missing a beat. The tension in the room finally snapped, deflating like a punctured tire. The medical staff immediately sprang into action. The nurse unlocked the wheels of the bed. As they began to roll me out into the hallway, Matthew walked exactly in step with the bed. His hand never left mine. His thumb traced circles over my knuckles, a continuous grounding point of contact. I stared up at the fluorescent lights passing by overhead. My mind, cynical and exhausted, started doing the math. This was a biological accident. Matthew Ryan didn't know me. He was a ruthless billionaire who fired people for rounding errors. My pain had triggered a biological booby trap in his brain. Right now he was acting like a mated alpha defending his territory. But what happens tomorrow? What happens when the blockers kick back in, when the pain fades and I go back to being a blank, scentless data analyst? The pheromone fog would lift. Matthew would look at me and realize he had hijacked a hospital wing for a nobody. He would feel embarrassed. Then he would feel resentful. In corporate America, you don't survive by making the CEO feel vulnerable. They wheeled me into the cold, heavily shielded MRI room. The doctor gently detached my hand from Matthew's. "I'll be right here." Matthew said, his voice hard, promising violence to anyone who touched me wrong. He stepped back into the observation booth, his imposing figure filling the frame of the window. I lay on the sliding table. The machine buzzed, a mechanical, soulless sound. I looked through the glass. Matthew was watching me with an intensity that made my chest ache worse than the broken bones. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. I closed my eyes as the machine slid me into the dark tube. "Enjoy it while it lasts." The cynical voice in my head whispered, "Ghosts don't get to keep the light." The dilaudid hit my bloodstream like a heavy velvet curtain, muffling the sharp, screaming edges of my fractured ribs into a dull, throbbing ache. When I finally woke up from the chemical sleep, the sterile harshness of the emergency room was gone. I was in a bed that felt like a cloud wrapped in linens with a thread count higher than my credit score. The room was massive, bathed in the soft, bruised purple light of dusk filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. There were no roommates. There was no beeping machinery, just a silent high-tech monitor bolted to the wall tracking my vitals in glowing green numbers. St. Jude's 5 IP Recovery Wing. The kind of room reserved for senators, celebrities, and men who could buy the building. Matthew Ryan was sitting in a leather armchair in the corner. The feral, frantic alpha who had threatened to break a doctor's arm was gone. In his place was the CEO. He had acquired a fresh shirt, crisp white and perfectly tailored, though he still wasn't wearing a tie. A sleek silver laptop was balanced on his knees. His fingers moved across the keyboard with silent, brutal efficiency. The scent of the winter storm was still present, but it was controlled now, banked. It smelled like the cold air rolling off a glacier rather than the avalanche itself. The pumpkin was turning back into a carriage. The biological glitch was correcting itself. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the familiar heavy weight of my own cynicism settle back into my chest. This was the part where the rich man realized he had made a mistake. He had let his primitive instincts hijack his brain over an injured employee. Soon, the embarrassment would set in. Then the clinical detachment. I just needed to make it easy for him to walk away so I wouldn't lose my severance package. I shifted slightly, trying to sit up. The movement tugged at the IV in my hand. The typing stopped instantly. Matthew closed the laptop with a soft click and set it on the side table. He stood up. He didn't rush over like a panicked mate, but his gaze was heavy, pinning me to the mattress. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his hands sliding into his pockets. "The MRI confirmed the fractures," Matthew said. His voice was smooth, a low baritone, devoid of the terrifying growl from the ER. "Fourth and fifth ribs. The right lung has a severe contusion, but there's no puncture. You don't need surgery, but you need strict bed rest." "Thank you," I said. My voice was raspy from sleep and dry air. "For getting me the doctors. You didn't have to do that." "You went into shock in the middle of my boardroom," Matthew replied smoothly. "It would have been a logistical nightmare to have a corpse on the 42nd floor. It was a joke, or at least the billionaire equivalent of one." But his eyes were entirely serious. They were scanning my face, checking the color of my skin, the dilation of my pupils. "I'll have HR email me the medical leave forms," I said, staring at my hands. "And the resignation paperwork. I assume Greg already told you I ruined the Q3 review." "Greg is currently being escorted out of the building by security," Matthew stated casually. My head snapped up. A sharp spike of pain hit my chest, but I ignored it. Why Greg didn't do anything? "Exactly," Matthew said. "The temperature in the room dropped a fraction of a degree. He managed a team. One of his analysts was in visible agony binding a shattered rib cage with gym tape, and he didn't notice. Then when that analyst collapsed, his first instinct was to complain about a PowerPoint presentation. He is a liability. I don't employ liabilities." "I'm the liability, Mr. Ryan." I countered, my voice tightening. I hated this. I hated the power imbalance. "I hid the injury. I'm a blank. I take blockers so nobody knows my dynamic, and today my biology short-circuited and gassed your executive board. You should fire me." Matthew stepped around the foot of the bed, moving into my personal space. He pulled a small plastic cup from the bedside table and held it out to me. Water with a straw. I hesitated, then leaned forward to take a sip. My hand shook. He didn't let go of the cup, steadying it against my mouth until I was done. "First of all," Matthew said, setting the cup down, "my name is Matthew. If you call me Mr. Ryan again while wearing a hospital gown, I am going to be profoundly irritated." I swallowed hard. "Secondly," he continued, leaning his hip against the edge of my mattress entirely too close, "you are not a blank. The scent you produced today was significant. It was a trauma response." I argued, my heart rate picking up on the monitor. The green numbers ticked faster. "It was an emergency flare. It triggered your alpha instincts. That's all this is. A biological accident. You smelled blood and your hindbrain took over. In 2 days, when the pain stops, my scent will die again. I will go back to being nothing. And you're going to feel very stupid for renting out the VIP wing for a data analyst." Matthew looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was watching a complex algorithm execute a flawed command. "You think very highly of your own deductive reasoning," Matthew murmured. "I look at the data. The data says alphas don't stick around when the omega doesn't smell like anything." Matthew leaned down. He brought his face level with mine. The scent of cold iron and snow suddenly surged, washing over me, thick and heavy. It wasn't a threat. It was an absolute suffocating blanket of dominance. "Let me clarify something for you, Leo." Matthew whispered, his eyes locked onto mine. "I do not operate on instinct. I am not a slave to my biology. I gutted a 50-year-old media empire and rebuilt it because I operate on facts. Do you want the facts?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded. "The fact is," Matthew said softly, You slipped on the ice. You couldn't afford a doctor because my company pays its lower-level analysts a baseline salary that doesn't account for Seattle's rising cost of living. You came to work bleeding because you were terrified of a culture I built. This isn't a biological glitch. This is a systemic failure of my organization, and I am taking personal responsibility for it. It was the most terrifyingly clinical way someone had ever claimed me. The door clicked open before I could formulate a response to Matthew's corporate-justified possessiveness. Dr. Miller walked in. He was a beta completely unaffected by the heavy pheromones currently saturating the room, though he did pause to eye Matthew's proximity to my bed. He carried a sleek digital tablet. "Ah, you're awake, Leo," Dr. Miller said, offering a practiced, comforting smile. "How is the pain level manageable?" "It's fine," I lied. It felt like an elephant was standing on my right lung, but the Dilaudid made me not care about the elephant. "Excellent. We've reviewed the scans." Dr. Miller tapped his screen. "The contusion is deep. You are incredibly lucky the ribs fractured outward rather than inward. However, the healing process for this is going to be incredibly strict. Your lung capacity is compromised. Any sudden strain, heavy lifting, or even a severe coughing fit could risk a secondary collapse." "When can I go home?" I asked immediately. "I have a fourth-floor walk-up. I need to figure out the stairs." "You aren't going anywhere near stairs," Dr. Miller said, his brow furrowing. "You need a minimum of 4 weeks of flat bed rest with a supervised respiratory therapy regimen." 4 weeks. Panic flared hot and sour in the back of my throat. I couldn't afford 4 weeks. I couldn't afford the food delivery fees, let alone the physical therapy. "I can't do 4 weeks. I live alone. I don't have anyone to—" "My staff will prepare the east wing of the Mercer Island property," Matthew interrupted smoothly. He wasn't looking at the doctor. He was looking at me. "It's entirely ground floor. The air filtration system is hospital grade. I'll have a respiratory therapist retained by tomorrow morning." I stared at him. "No." Matthew blinked. It was a slow, deliberate movement. "Excuse me." "No." I repeated, my voice finding a steady, desperate footing. "I am not moving into your house." Dr. Miller cleared his throat awkwardly, looking between the two of us. "I'll just go verify your discharge paperwork. We can keep you here for another 48 hours for observation." He practically bolted from the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthew stood up straight. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. The fabric of his shirt pulled tight across his shoulders. "Explain your logic," Matthew demanded. It was the tone he used to dismantle executives. "I am not a charity case," I said, gripping the expensive bedsheets. "I am not a kept Omega. I pay rent for an apartment. I have a life. It might be a small, miserable life right now, but it's mine." "Your apartment is a fourth-floor walk-up," Matthew stated, his voice completely flat. "You live alone. You cannot lift a jug of water without risking a lung collapse. How do you propose to feed yourself? I'll figure it out. That is an emotional response, not a logical one." "I don't care," I snapped immediately, wincing as the sharp volume pulled at my chest. I forced myself to take a shallow breath. "You don't get it. You're Matthew Ryan. You see a broken thing and you want to fix it. You want to throw money at it until it's optimal again. But I am not a broken algorithm. I am a person. And when my chest heals and my scent goes back to dead air I don't want to be sitting in a billionaire's mansion wondering when you're going to realize I'm boring and ask me to leave. Mosto pocha sim. Matthew stared at me. The muscles in his jaw ticked. He didn't yell. He didn't unleash his alpha pheromones to force me into submission. Instead, he uncrossed his arms, walked to the side of the bed, and pulled the leather armchair right up to the mattress. He sat down. "Leo," Matthew said quietly, "do you know what my dynamic is?" I frowned, confused by the pivot. "You're an alpha." "I am a prime alpha," Matthew corrected. "My biology is designed to conquer, to command. It is loud, it is aggressive, and it is entirely suffocating to 99% of the population. I spend a fortune on custom suppressants just so my employees can be in the same room as me without experiencing a panic attack." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "I don't want honey," Matthew said, his voice dropping into a rough, intimate register. "I don't want lavender. I don't want an omega who floods the room with sweet, compliant pheromones every time I raise my voice. It makes me nauseous." He reached out. His large, warm hand covered my cold fingers, resting on the blanket. "Today in that boardroom, you didn't smell like submission." Matthew continued, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "You smelled like survival. You smelled like someone who was holding the entire world on his shoulders and refusing to break. And when you finally did break, you didn't ask for help. You apologized for the inconvenience." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. I wanted to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. He was an anchor in a raging storm. "You think I'll lose interest when your scent fades?" Matthew asked, a dark, completely feral smirk briefly touching the corner of his mouth. "Leo, the quiet is the best part about you. I live in a world of noise. You are the only person I have met in 3 years who doesn't smell like fear or greed. You smell like peace." He squeezed my hand gently. "You are coming to my house," Matthew stated. It wasn't an alpha command this time. It was a promise. "You will not pay rent. You will heal. And when you are fully recovered, if you want to walk out the front door and go back to your 4th floor walk-up, I will not stop you." I looked at his eyes. The cold, calculating gray was gone, replaced by a terrifying, deeply human vulnerability. He meant it. He would let me go. Which meant, of course, that I was already trapped. "Fine," I whispered, closing my eyes. "But I'm picking the movies." "Deal," the billionaire said. Mercer Island wasn't a neighborhood. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and old money surrounded by the dark, churning waters of Lake Washington. Matthew's house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. It should have felt like a museum. It should have felt cold. But the moment the private medical transport wheeled me through the front doors, the absolute stillness of the place settled over me, like a heavy protective blanket. There were no bustling servants. There was no echoing emptiness. There was just a state-of-the-art kitchen, a living room sunken into the floor, and the east wing my wing. My room was larger than my entire apartment. The bed was positioned so I could look out at the lake without lifting my head. There was a stack of paperbacks on the nightstand, all science fiction and history, exactly what I usually read on my lunch breaks. Someone had gone to my walk-up, packed my clothes, and brought my things. But they hadn't just dumped them in a closet. They had arranged them with a meticulous, quiet respect. The first week was miserable. Healing is not a graceful process. The Dilaudid wore off, replaced by a strict regimen of Tylenol and physical limitations that made me feel entirely useless. I couldn't shower standing up. I couldn't reach for a glass on a high shelf without blinding pain radiating through my chest. Matthew was a ghost during the day. He ran Ryan Omnimedia from the top floor of his skyscraper, leaving me in the care of a beta physical therapist named Daisy. She was ruthlessly efficient, guiding me through the agonizing breathing exercises necessary to keep my bruised lung from filling with fluid. But at 6 p.m. every single evening, the front door would unlock. Matthew didn't bring the office home. He would walk through the door, shrug off his suit jacket, and completely power down the dominant, terrifying alpha that ran the corporate world. He would wash his hands, walk into my room, and just exist. He didn't hover. He didn't treat me like a fragile piece of glass. On Tuesday of the second week, he sat on the edge of my bed with a laptop typing quietly while I watched a terrible low-budget horror movie. The structural integrity of that cabin makes absolutely no sense, Matthew commented dryly, not looking up from his screen, as a monster smashed through a wall. It's a metaphor for the fragility of the human ego, Matthew. I deadpanned, clutching a pillow to my chest to brace my ribs. Try to keep up. The corner of his mouth twitched. He closed his laptop. He looked at me, his gray eyes catching the blue light of the television screen. You're not taking your blockers, he noted. I stiffened. It was true. The medical team had flushed my system to ensure the painkillers didn't interact with the synthetic hormones in the pills. For the first time since I was a teenager, I was entirely unmedicated. No, I said defensively, pulling the blanket up a fraction of an inch. I told you. I don't have a cent. I'm a blank. Matthew stood up. He walked to the side of the bed, leaning over me slightly. He didn't touch me, but the sheer physical proximity of him made the hair on my arms stand up. He took a slow, deliberate breath. You aren't a blank, Leo, he murmured, his voice rumbling low in his chest. I don't smell like anything. You smell like rain on concrete, Matthew corrected softly. You smell like old books. You smell like the air right before the sun comes up. He leaned back, his eyes dark and heavy. It isn't loud. It isn't trying to manipulate me. It just simply is. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. That's not exactly prime mating material. Omegas are supposed to smell sweet. I told you. Matthew said, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. I hate sweet. The rest of the world is drowning in sugar. You are the only place I can actually breathe. He turned and walked out of the room to get us dinner. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my bruised ribs. The cynicism that had protected me for 26 years was cracking. It was fracturing faster than the bones in my chest. He wasn't keeping me here out of guilt. He wasn't acting on a lingering chemical trauma bond. He was keeping me here because he actually wanted me. Over the next 2 weeks, the routine solidified into something dangerously close to domesticity. I graduated from the bed to the sofa. We ate dinner together every night. Sometimes we talked about the company he actually listened when I pointed out flaws in his data acquisition models. Most of the time we just sat in silence. I learned the subtle shifts in his scent. When he was stressed about a board meeting, the winter storm smelled sharper, like cracking ice. When he was sitting next to me on the couch, watching me tear apart the plot holes in a sci-fi movie, the coldness faded. It smelled like a heavy, quiet snowfall. Protective. Insulating. I was healing. My lung capacity returned. The terrible sharp agony in my ribs faded to a dull, manageable ache. And then day 28 arrived. Dr. Miller packed his stethoscope into his leather bag. "Your lung sounds perfectly clear, Leo," the doctor said, offering a warm smile. "The ribs are fusing nicely. You still need to avoid heavy lifting for another month, but the critical window is closed. You are officially cleared off bed rest." "Thank you, doctor," I said. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing my own clothes, a faded gray hoodie and a pair of worn jeans. They felt strange against my skin after a month of expensive cotton pajamas. Dr. Miller let himself out. The heavy front door of the house clicked shut. I was alone. Matthew was at the office. This was the deal. 4 weeks. I heal, and then I walk out the front door. I pulled my duffel bag from the closet. I started folding my few t-shirts, placing them inside. My hands were entirely steady, but my chest felt hollow. It felt worse than the day I fell on the ice. The rational part of my brain, the data analyst, was screaming at me. This was a temporary arrangement. You do not belong here. He is a billionaire. You are a rounding error. Leave before he has to ask you to leave. I zipped the bag shut. I swung the strap over my shoulder. It pulled slightly at my ribs, a dull twinge of a reminder. I walked out of the bedroom down the long sunlit hallway and stepped into the living room. Matthew was standing by the glass doors facing the lake. I stopped dead in my tracks. He wasn't supposed to be here. It was 2 p.m. on a Thursday. He was supposed to be dismantling a tech startup in a boardroom. He was wearing a dark suit, but the tie was already gone. He turned around as I entered the room. His eyes dropped immediately to the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The air in the room instantly plummeted in temperature. The heavy, terrifying scent of the winter storm flooded the space sharp and violent. The alpha inside him was reacting to the visual cue of his claimed Omega packing a bag. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to drop my eyes, to bare my neck, to submit to the overwhelming biological pressure rolling off him in waves. Matthew took a step forward. His jaw was locked tight enough to crack teeth. "Leo!" His voice was a rasp, barely recognizable. "The doctor cleared me," I said. My voice shook, betraying the calm front I was trying to project. "The 4 weeks are up. I'm fixed." Matthew looked at the bag again. The muscles in his neck strained. I could physically see the war happening inside him, the feral primitive need to lock the doors and keep me here against the logical, conscious promise he had made me. "You have an apartment," Matthew said, stating a fact, though the words sounded like they were choking him. "A 4th-floor walk-up," I confirmed. "Your rent is paid." "Through the end of the year," he said. I had Claire handle it. I blinked, genuinely caught off guard. "You didn't have to do that." "I did." He took another step. He was entirely too close now. The scent of ozone and ice was suffocating, but beneath it I didn't smell anger. I smelled absolute, profound terror. The man who terrified Wall Street was terrified of me walking out the door. "Matthew," I whispered, "I gave you my word." Matthew said, his voice dropping into that low, vibrating register that rattled my bones. "I told you that when you were healed, if you wanted to walk out that door, I would not stop you." He didn't break eye contact. Slowly, agonizingly, Matthew took a step to the side. He cleared the path to the front door. He was letting me go. He was an alpha hardwired for possession, standing in his own territory, and he was physically overriding his own biology to respect my autonomy. He wasn't treating me like an omega. He was treating me like an equal. I looked at the heavy oak front door. Then I looked back at Matthew. His hands were curled into fists at his sides, his knuckles stark white. He looked like a man standing in front of a firing squad just waiting for the bullet. The cynicism finally died. The data didn't matter anymore. The math was completely irrelevant. I took a breath. I smelled rain on concrete. I smelled the quiet air before the dawn. It was my scent, and it was rising to meet the winter storm. I let the duffel bag slide off my shoulder. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Matthew flinched at the sound. He looked down at the bag, then slowly brought his eyes back up to my face. I hate the stairs in my apartment. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Matthew stared at me. The absolute shock on his face was the most beautifully human thing I had ever seen. I also don't know how to cook. I continued taking a step toward him, closing the distance he had just opened. And your television is much bigger than mine. Matthew let out a sound of fractured, breathless exhale that held no corporate polish, no alpha dominance. It was just relief. Pure, unadulterated relief. He closed the remaining distance between us. He didn't grab me. He didn't haul me against him. He reached out with terrifying gentleness, his large hands framing my face. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones. "Are you sure?" Matthew asked, his voice shaking. "Because if you stay now, Leo, I am never opening that door again." "Close it," I whispered. Matthew leaned down. He pressed his forehead against mine, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He breathed in deeply, inhaling the scent of rain and old books, grounding himself in the absolute quiet of my biology. I wrapped my arms around his waist, careful of my ribs, but holding on tight. The winter storm wrapped around me, but it wasn't freezing anymore. It was just home. I spent 26 years thinking I was broken because I didn't make any noise. It turned out I was just waiting for a man who needed the silence, and that's the end of Leo and Matthew's story. Sometimes what we think is our biggest defect is exactly what makes us perfect for the right person. Did you expect Matthew to actually keep his promise and step aside? Or did you think his alpha instincts would take over? Let me know your favorite moment down in the comments. If you love this deeply emotional, grounded take on the Omegaverse, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more original, heart-wrenching stories every single week.